some of the most blatant lies spewed by those intent on destroying Christianity in public life argue that America was never a Christian nation, and that our founding fathers were either atheists or agnostics or deists. But the truth is that the enemies of Christianity cannot separate our country from its Christian foundations.
Properly understood, there should be a separation of church and state, one that prohibits the federal government from controlling religion and churches. At a time when religious people are being targeted more and more by government through bad policies, unelected bureaucrats, and liberal activists, we would do well to remember Jefferson's vision.
Almost on a daily basis, we hear in the news of another incident where God, Christ, the Bible are being stripped out of American civilization. This has been going on for perhaps half a century. And the key expression that you hear constantly, separation of church and state. Why can we no longer have Christmas vacation in the public schools, instead winter holidays? Well, because we can't have any reference to religion, or at least Christianity, in our public schools. And so it's being stripped out of our public schools, it's being stripped out of our government, and it's being stripped out of public life.
How many times have you heard someone say, separation of church and state isn't in the Constitution? You know what else isn't in the Constitution? No murdering, no rape, no insider trading. Interestingly, only 3 things are crimes in the Constitution: treason, piracy, and counterfeiting. You see, it is slightly impossible to make sure to include every possible grammatical combination of words that could be used for a single idea. A right to bear arms, for instance, is in the Bill of Rights, but a right to have guns sure isn't. Would it be reasonable for a gun critic to make the argument that right to have guns isn't in the Bill of Rights, and a pitchfork or bat could be considered arms, therefore one's right to have guns is not protected, but the right to have pitchforks and bats is? I certainly doubt that most of those who use the same type of argument against the separation of church and state would accept that anti-gun argument. Instead of such unreasonable specificity, general principles were strongly expressed in the Constitution as the way things should be, or as a general outline on how to proceed forward. Among those was a separation of church and state, and the premise that the government should be absolutely neutral to religion, which were expressed in the First Amendment and the No Religious Test Clause of Article 6 of the Constitution. In giving such principles, the U.S. founders did not intend for these federal-level principles to be completely disregarded at the state and local levels, despite having not initially provided any enforcement for those principles at the state and local level. It was to be the spirit with which to move forward with. Luckily, Congress, in 1868, did indeed move bounds forward with this sentiment when they passed the 14th Amendment. This amendment enabled the Bill of Rights and the federal law to now be applied to the states, thus spreading the separation of church and state to the deepest firmaments of America. But still, how do we know what the founders meant with the First Amendment's religious clause? That is easy. Just look at their own writings and behaviors. One of the strongest lines of evidence was that, in a detached memorandum to the First Amendment, there was direct mention of the separation of religion and government by its author, James Madison, where he elaborated on what was meant by the First Amendment. In it he said, "Strongly guarded, as is the separation between religion and government in the Constitution of the United States, the danger of encroachment by ecclesiastical bodies may be illustrated by precedents already furnished in their long history. Besides the danger of a direct mixture of religion and civil government, there is an evil which ought to be guarded against in the indefinite accumulation of property from the capacity of holding it in perpetuity by ecclesiastical corporations. The excessive wealth of ecclesiastical corporations and the misuse of it in many countries of Europe has long been a topic of complaint." This was directly along the same lines Madison strode in his memorial and remonstrance against religious assessment in the Virginia Assembly years earlier. There he wrote, "We maintain therefore that in matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance. True it is, and no other rule exists, by which any question may divide a society, can be ultimately determined but the will of the majority. But it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority." Jefferson too made a powerful statement at the same Virginia Assembly. In his vigorous argument in support of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, he said, "Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." In other words, freedom of religion and freedom from religion. The official position of the nascent federal government held to those same principles, as attested by the often rightfully mentioned Treaty of Tripoli, in which was stated that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Some claim absurdly that this was entirely the U.S. government trying to appease the Islamic Barbary states. Appeasement was certainly one goal, but it seems kind of like a necessary overkill for a government to ratify a treaty such as this one purely for appeasement if they didn't believe what was in the treaty, especially when there are other avenues for appeasement. No, it is more reasonable to conclude that the government was so quick to put this in the treaty because it was truly how they felt. The president who signed the treaty, John Adams, even later in his life attended the 1820 Massachusetts Constitutional Convention to argue for complete religious liberty and the disestablishment of religion in Massachusetts, so the statement made by the Treaty of Tripoli wouldn't exactly be against his character. It is exceedingly difficult to deny that Jefferson meant exactly what he said to the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people which declare that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Some say the wall of separation was only meant to protect churches from government and not the government from overbearing religion. However, that seems pretty clearly contradicted in a letter by Jefferson to his friend Benjamin Rush. He said, "I agree with you likewise in your wishes to keep religion and government independent of each other. Were it possible for St. Paul to rise from his grave at the present juncture, he would say to the clergy who are now so active in settling political affairs in the world, 'Cease from your political labors, your kingdom is not of this world. Read my epistles. In no part of them will you perceive me aiming to depose a pagan emperor, or to place a Christian upon a throne. Christianity disdains to receive support from human governments.'" James Madison, best friend and protege to Jefferson and writer of the First Amendment, put all these things into practice when he became president. He boldly vetoed bills that were to allocate surplus land to churches. Madison's reason was that there was an evil which ought to be guarded against in the indefinite accumulation of property by ecclesiastical corporations. Madison also voiced strong opposition to putting chaplains in Congress to open sessions with prayer. He said, "In strictness, the Constitution of the U.S. forbids everything like an establishment of a national religion. The law appointing chaplains establishes a religious worship for the national representatives to be performed by ministers of religion, elected by a majority of them, and these are to be paid out of the national taxes." Following this unmistakable trend, he was also against government-sponsored Day of Prayer. He said that it would imply and certainly nourish the erroneous idea of a national religion.
I think it started when Madalyn Murray O'Hair complained she didn't want any prayer in our schools. And we said, okay. Then someone said you better not read the Bible in school. The Bible says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and love your neighbors yourself. And we said, okay.
But what of the claims that Christianity is being taken out of schools and everything else? That it's being stripped out of public life? Are liberals against only Christianity? Are liberals actually against religion? The answers are all in the negative. Christians can practice their religion in school and anywhere else. They just can't make others practice their religion, and government-paid employees of those institutions can't establish that religion by leading religious activities themselves. Children can read Bibles in school, and they can have student-led voluntary Bible studies. Liberals can't be against Christianity, since Pew and Gallup consistently find roughly 70% of Democrats identify as Christians. The 30% that aren't Christian also probably aren't against Christians. Accepting Jefferson, Madison, and the other founding fathers' concept of the separation of church and state, and not holding one religion above all the others by law, is not the same as being against Christianity. It isn't a zero-sum game. Being for the equal treatment of all religious and non-religious dispositions isn't the equivalent to being against Christianity. Well, what about the claim that the U.S. is a Christian nation? It depends entirely on what you mean by Christian nation. If you mean that America has more followers of Christianity compared to other religions, then you would be correct. You would even be mostly correct by saying most of the pre-U.S. British colonies were founded on Christianity, though this is one of the things that the founders at the time of the creation of the Constitution were rebelling against. Puritans were hanging Quakers for heresy in Massachusetts, and Anglicans were hanging Puritans and Quakers in Virginia. So within these bounds, you could say that what would later become the U.S. was Christian, violently so. However, if by Christian nation you meant that the philosophic ideals behind our federal government's laws and structure were based on the Bible and Christianity, you would be wrong. The fathers of the Constitution, including 2 presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Ben Franklin, were all skeptical men of the Enlightenment who would more often quote Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke or Greek philosophers like Aristotle or Epicurus rather than the Bible. John Adams was a Unitarian, but he too often quoted the Greeks, Romans, and Enlightenment philosophers. None of this is a surprise, because the university Jefferson, Madison, and many other founders attended was well known as a hotbed of deism and Enlightenment thinking, the College of William and Mary. Jefferson's favorite teacher at the college, William Small, was fresh out of Scotland during the time of David Hume, and would later befriend Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin. So no, the U.S. federal government certainly was not founded on Christianity.